The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the humid Georgia air, poised to fall on lot number 73, a vessel so battered that seagulls wouldn't dare rest on its splintered deck. What nobody in that concrete warehouse knew, what the police department couldn't have possibly discovered during their cursory inspection, was that beneath layers of salt water damage and neglect, sealed behind a panel that looked like every other ruined surface on that boat, lay a secret that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about one of America's most notorious maritime disappearances. This is a story that begins with $400 and ends with a mystery that the FBI still refuses to fully explain. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover how a hand-drawn map hidden inside a condemned sailboat led to a fortune that was never supposed to be found, how one man's gamble at a police auction connected directly to a cold case that haunted coastal investigators for over 3 decades, and why the treasure he eventually uncovered came with a price that money can't measure. What happened to Derek Hutchins after he bought that boat will challenge everything you think you know about luck, fate, and the dangerous allure of other people's secrets. This is a lesson every sailor, every treasure hunter, every person who's ever chased a dream needs to understand, because what Derek found wasn't just gold and jewels. He found proof that some fortunes are lost for very deliberate reasons. Derek Hutchins was 42 years old when he walked into the Chatham County Police Department's annual asset seizure auction on a September morning that felt more like mid-July. He was a marine diesel mechanic by trade, a man whose hands bore the permanent stains of engine grease and whose fingernails carried crescents of black no amount of scrubbing could remove. For 15 years, Derek had worked at a boatyard in Savannah, repairing the engines of vessels owned by people who would never acknowledge him at a yacht club. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like coffee and WD-40, drove a truck held together by rust and determination, and harbored a dream that burned so intensely it kept him awake most nights. Derek wanted his own sailboat, not to impress anyone, not to join the leisure class that he serviced daily, but to feel what his grandfather had described to him as a boy, that sensation of being utterly alone with the ocean, where the only sounds were wind through rigging and water against hull, where a man could think without interruption, where life simplified itself to the elemental truths of navigation and weather. His grandfather had crossed the Atlantic twice, had sailed solo from Charleston to the Azores and back, and had died when Derek was 19, leaving him nothing but stories and a compass that no longer worked. For 23 years since that funeral, Derek had saved money in an old tackle box hidden in his closet. Every extra $20, every bonus check, every tax refund went into that box. He had sacrificed vacations, new furniture, even relationships that demanded more financial commitment than he was willing to give. His ex-girlfriend had once screamed at him that he loved an imaginary boat more than he loved her, and Derek hadn't argued because, in a way, she was right. By September of that year, the tackle box contained $11,347 in cash, wadded bills that smelled like metal, and dreams deferred. The sailboat that caught Derek's attention at the auction was a 38-foot sloop that the police had seized 6 months earlier during a drug bust in the Wilmington River. The hull was fiberglass, sun-bleached to the color of old bones, and the deck was a minefield of rot and broken hardware. The mast had been removed and lay alongside the boat like a fallen soldier, its aluminum surface pitted with corrosion. Every window was either cracked or missing entirely, replaced by plywood sheets spray-painted with gang tags and crude drawings. The sails, if they still existed, were nowhere visible. The interior, from what Derek could glimpse through a missing porthole, looked like a hurricane had fought a bonfire inside and both had lost. But Derek saw past all of that destruction. He saw the lines of the hull, which were classic and true. He saw the keel, which appeared structurally sound, despite its coat of barnacles and marine growth. He saw the rudder, still attached and functioning when he tested it. Most importantly, he saw a boat that everyone else at the auction was actively avoiding, which meant the price would stay low. The auctioneer described the vessel as being sold as is, where is, with no warranty expressed or implied and no guarantee of fitness for any purpose whatsoever. The starting bid was set at $500. Derek's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal seeking freedom. When the auctioneer asked for opening bids, the warehouse fell silent except for the industrial fans pushing hot air around the space. Derek raised his hand and bid $400, breaking the auction's own minimum. The auctioneer, eager to move past this particular lot, hesitated only briefly before his gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Sold to bidder 89 for $400. Next up, we have a jet ski with trailer. Derek had just purchased his first sailboat for less than the cost of the marine survey that any sane person would have commissioned before such a purchase. The first 3 weeks of ownership were a masterclass in humility and manual labor. Derek took vacation time from the boatyard and worked on his boat from sunrise until his muscles refused further commands. He scraped barnacles until his shoulders screamed. He patched holes with fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin, working in the punishing heat that made the resin cure too fast and forced him to work in frantic bursts. He discovered that the engine, a diesel Yanmar that should have been reliable, had been gutted for parts, leaving behind only the engine block bolted to its mounts like a tombstone, marking the death of propulsion. The electrical system was a rat's nest of cut wires and corroded connections that would need to be completely replaced. The water tanks were filled with a liquid that resembled primordial soup and smelled like death itself. But Derek also discovered unexpected gifts. The hull, once he pressure washed away the marine growth, revealed no major damage beyond cosmetic scarring. The deck, beneath its rotted top layer, had solid fiberglass that could be repaired rather than replaced. The rigging, though corroded, was stainless steel of a quality that suggested someone had once cared deeply about this vessel's maintenance. As Derek worked, he began to imagine the boat's history. Who had owned it before the drug dealers? What waters had it sailed? What storms had it weathered? He found small clues, fragments of a past life, a child's drawing, sun-faded beyond recognition, wedged behind a cabinet, a woman's earring, silver and tarnished, lodged in a crack in the floorboards. A paperback novel swollen with water damage, its title obliterated, its pages fused into a solid block. Each artifact hinted at lives lived aboard, at families and journeys and moments of happiness that predated whatever circumstances led to the boat's seizure and abandonment. The discovery happened on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks and 4 days after the auction. Derek was removing a panel in the navigation station, a desk-like area near the companionway where charts and instruments would traditionally be housed. The panel had been painted over so many times that the screw heads were nearly invisible, buried under layers of white enamel that had aged to the color of old teeth. Derek used a heat gun to soften the paint, then carefully extracted the screws, their threads stripped and damaged from previous removals. When the panel finally came free, he expected to find the usual tangle of wires and possibly some water damage to the bulkhead behind it. Instead, he found a space that had been deliberately sealed. Someone had constructed a false back to the navigation station, creating a hidden compartment approximately 12 inches deep, 18 inches wide, and 20 inches tall. Inside that compartment, wrapped in multiple layers of heavy-duty plastic bags that had been heat-sealed at the edges, was a waterproof Pelican case, the kind used by photographers and military personnel to protect sensitive equipment from the elements. Derek's hands trembled as he extracted the case from its hiding place. It was heavy, perhaps 15 pounds, and completely dry despite the humidity and water damage that had invaded every other part of the boat. The case was locked, but the lock was a simple combination mechanism rather than a key system. Derek carried the case up to the cockpit, where the evening light was better, and sat down on the only bench that wasn't rotted through. He tried obvious combinations at first, simple sequences like 000 and 123, but the lock refused to open. Then, on an impulse he couldn't explain, he tried a combination based on the boat's registration number, which was still visible on the hull despite the deterioration. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet marina. Inside the Pelican case, resting on a bed of foam padding, were items that made Derek's breath catch in his throat. The first was a hand-drawn map on waterproof paper, the kind used by serious blue-water sailors. The map depicted a section of coastline that Derek immediately recognized as the Georgia and South Carolina Barrier Islands, but with markings and annotations that transformed it from a simple navigational chart into something far more significant. There were coordinates written in the margins, GPS waypoints marked with precision, and a series of X marks, 6 in total, scattered across the map in locations that appeared to correspond to small, uninhabited islands and coastal marshes. Each X was accompanied by a number written in red ink, figures that ranged from 50,000 to 230,000. The second item in the case was a ledger, a physical notebook with a black cover that had been filled with meticulous handwriting. The entries were dated, spanning a period from May to September of a year that Derek realized with a shock was 31 years ago. The ledger detailed what appeared to be a smuggling operation, but not drugs or weapons. The entries described jewelry, specifically high-end estate jewelry, watches, and loose gemstones. Each entry included a date, a description of items, their estimated value, and cryptic references to acquisitions and distributions. The handwriting was neat, almost obsessive in its precision, the work of someone who approached illegal activity with the same meticulousness they might bring to accounting or engineering. The third item was a photograph, color, but faded with age, showing 3 men standing on the deck of a sailboat. Derek turned the photo over and found names written on the back in the same handwriting as the ledger. Michael, Ray, J.D. Last sunset before the end. The sailboat in the photograph was clearly the same vessel Derek was sitting in, but in its prime, with gleaming teak decks and crisp white sails. Derek sat in the cockpit as darkness fell around him, the marsh grasses rustling in the evening breeze, and tried to process what he had discovered. He was holding evidence of crimes committed 3 decades ago, crimes that apparently involved significant amounts of stolen property that had been hidden across the coastal islands. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him employed and out of trouble for 42 years, screamed at him to take everything to the police immediately. But another part of his brain, a part he didn't entirely recognize or approve of, whispered different suggestions. The crimes were 31 years old. The statute of limitations on theft in Georgia was 4 years. Whoever had hidden these items was either dead, in prison, or had long since abandoned any hope of recovery. The coordinates on the map were precise enough to find, assuming the landmarks and geography hadn't changed significantly in 3 decades. If the items were still there, if they hadn't been discovered by chance or destroyed by time and weather, they represented a fortune that could transform Derek's life completely. He could stop working on diesel engines that left his hands permanently stained. He could buy a boat that didn't require months of repair before it could float without sinking. He could sail to all the places his grandfather had described, could finally live the dream that had sustained him through 2 decades of saving money in a tackle box. All he had to do was become the kind of person who would steal treasure from a treasure thief, who would claim property that had been stolen from someone else 31 years ago, who would cross a moral line he had never seriously considered crossing before in his life. For 3 days, Derek did nothing but work on the boat and think. He researched the history of the vessel using the registration numbers and what few records he could access online. The boat had been built in Florida in 1987, had changed hands several times through the 90s, and had been seized by police during a drug interdiction operation that had nothing to do with its earlier history. He searched newspaper archives for jewelry thefts from 31 years ago and found dozens of reports, a wave of high-end burglaries that had plagued coastal Georgia and South Carolina during that summer. The thefts had been sophisticated, targeting wealthy homes during specific windows when the owners were known to be absent, and the total haul was estimated at over $3 million in jewelry and gemstones. The investigation had stalled, when the primary suspects, three men, whose names Derek cross-referenced with the photograph, had disappeared. One body, identified as Michael Brennan, had washed up on Tybee Island 3 months after the thefts, showing signs of drowning and blunt force trauma that police couldn't definitively classify as accidental or homicide. The other two men, Ray Cortez and James David J.D. Sullivan, had never been found, and the jewelry had never been recovered. The case had eventually gone cold, filed away in the unsolved crimes that haunted every police department, a loose end that would never be properly tied. Derek realized that the map in his possession represented answers to questions that investigators had asked decades ago, that families had asked about their stolen heirlooms, that insurance companies had asked about millions of dollars in losses. He also realized that those answers came with enormous risks. If he recovered the items and tried to sell them, even through black market channels, he could be caught and charged with receiving stolen property. If he turned everything over to police, he would get nothing except perhaps a commendation letter that wouldn't pay his rent. If he tried to return items to their original owners, assuming he could even identify them after 3 decades, he would have to explain how he found them, which would lead to questions he couldn't answer without incriminating himself. On the 4th day, Derek made his decision. He would investigate one location, just one, to see if the map was accurate and if anything remained to be found after 31 years of exposure to weather, tides, and chance discovery. If he found nothing, he would turn the entire Pelican case over to the police and wash his hands of the whole affair. If he found something, he would make his decision based on what that something was and whether recovering it seemed worth the risk. He chose the location marked with the smallest value, $50,000, reasoning that it would be the least significant loss if he was caught or if the site had been compromised. The coordinates pointed to a small spoil island in the marshes north of Savannah, an artificial island created from dredged material when the shipping channels were deepened decades ago. The island was uninhabited, accessible only by small boat at high tide, and covered with scrub vegetation and marsh grasses that would hide anything buried there. Derek waited for a Saturday morning when he had no work obligations, packed a small backpack with a folding shovel, GPS unit, water and sandwiches, and borrowed a kayak from a friend at the marina with a story about wanting to photograph birds in the marsh. The morning was overcast and humid, the kind of weather that promised afternoon thunderstorms, and the marsh channels were dark and still as Derek paddled northward. He followed the GPS coordinates on his phone, comparing them to the hand-drawn map, and found the spoil island exactly where the map indicated. It was small, perhaps 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, rising only a few feet above the high tide line. The vegetation was thick, mostly spartina grass and wax myrtle bushes, and the ground was spongy with moisture and decaying plant material. Derek pulled the kayak up onto the island and secured it to a sturdy bush. According to the map, the cache was buried 15 paces due south from the highest point of the island, approximately 3 feet deep, marked by 3 stones in a triangle. Derek found the high point easily enough, a slight rise in the center of the island, and began pacing south, his steps careful and measured. At 15 paces, he stopped and began searching for the marker stones. It took 20 minutes of pushing aside grass and probing the soft ground with a stick before he found them. 3 pieces of granite, each about the size of a grapefruit, arranged in a triangle exactly as described. The stones were partially buried now, sunk into the ground by 3 decades of settling and erosion, but they were still in position, still marking the spot. Derek's heart pounded as he began to dig. The ground was soft at first, mostly mud and decomposed vegetation. But as he went deeper, the material became more compact, harder to excavate. At 2 feet, his shovel struck something solid that was definitely not stone. He dug more carefully now, using his hands to feel the object, and realized he was touching metal. It took another 15 minutes to expose the object enough to extract it, a military surplus ammunition can, the kind designed to keep contents dry even in combat conditions. The can was heavy, And when Derek shook it gently, he heard the sound of objects shifting inside, the muffled clink of metal on metal. His hands shook as he pried open the lid, the seal resisting at first, before giving way with a pop of equalized pressure. Inside the ammunition can, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth to prevent corrosion, was a collection of jewelry that took Derek's breath away. There were necklaces with diamonds that caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky, bracelets heavy with gold and gemstones, rings with settings so intricate they looked like miniature sculptures, and a collection of loose stones in a plastic bag, emeralds and sapphires and rubies that represented more concentrated wealth than Derek had ever seen in one place. He had found it. The map was real, the cash was real, and in his hands he held items worth easily the $50,000 that had been noted on the map, probably much more. Derek sat on the muddy ground of that small island, surrounded by marsh grass and the distant sound of boats on the shipping channel, and felt the weight of a decision he could no longer avoid. He could take this ammunition can, return to his kayak, and paddle back to the marina with a fortune in stolen jewelry. He could then either attempt to sell it or hide it, becoming in that moment the same kind of person as the men who had buried it here 3 decades ago. Or he could rebury the can, mark the location carefully, return home, and turn everything over to the authorities, choosing honor over fortune. For almost an hour, Derek sat there wrestling with himself. He thought about his grandfather, who had sailed across oceans but had died with almost nothing to his name, except stories and principles. He thought about the families who had lost these items, heirlooms that might have been passed down for generations before being stolen. He thought about the life he could build with the money these items would bring, the freedom and adventure that had sustained him through 2 decades of mundane labor. He thought about who he wanted to be versus who he was afraid he might become. Derek made his choice. He carefully wrapped the jewelry back in its oil-soaked cloth, placed everything back in the ammunition can, sealed the lid, and buried the can in its hole. He replaced the soil, packed it down carefully, and rearranged the marker stones to their original position. Then he used his phone to take detailed photographs of the location, the GPS coordinates, and the surrounding landmarks. He paddled back to the marina with an empty backpack and a decision that felt both right and impossibly difficult. That evening, Derek called the Chatham County Police Department and asked to speak with someone in the investigative division about an old cold case. The detective who took his call was skeptical at first, probably accustomed to false leads and conspiracy theorists, but became intensely interested when Derek mentioned the jewelry thefts from 31 years ago. Derek agreed to bring in what he had found on the sailboat and to provide a full statement. 2 days later, Derek sat in an interview room at the police department with Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran investigator who specialized in property crimes, and laid out the entire story. He showed her the Pelican case, the map, the ledger, and the photograph. He described finding the cash on the Spoil Island and his decision to rebury it and report it instead of taking it. Detective Martinez listened without interruption, taking notes, and when Derek finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Hutchins, what you've done here is extraordinary. Most people in your position would have kept this quiet and tried to profit from it. You understand that you're not entitled to any finder's fee or reward, correct? This is evidence in multiple felony cases, and the property, if recovered, will be returned to its rightful owners or their heirs." Derek nodded. "I understand. I just wanted to do the right thing." Detective Martinez smiled, a weary expression that suggested she didn't hear that phrase often in her line of work. The right thing. Well, let me tell you what happens next. What happened next was an investigation that took 4 months and involved multiple law enforcement agencies. Using Derek's map and the coordinates from the ledger, police recovered 5 of the 6 caches marked on the map. The 6th location, on a barrier island that had been developed into private residences in the intervening decades, had apparently been discovered during construction and was never reported. The jewelry likely sold off by whoever found it. The total value of the recovered items was over $2 million, and forensic analysis confirmed that the jewelry matched descriptions from the original theft reports 3 decades earlier. The investigation also finally closed the loop on what happened to Ray Cortez and J.D. Sullivan. Analysis of the ledger and additional evidence found in one of the caches suggested that Michael Brennan had been killed by his partners in a dispute over the division of the stolen goods, and that Cortez and Sullivan had then fled the country, likely to Central America, with whatever portable wealth they could carry. Interpol was notified, but after 31 years, the chances of finding either man alive were slim. The families who had been victimized by the original thefts were contacted, and emotional reunions occurred as people recovered items they had thought lost forever. A woman in her 70s was reunited with her grandmother's engagement ring, a piece she had mourned losing more than all the other stolen items combined. A man received back a pocket watch that had belonged to his great-grandfather, a family heirloom that carried more sentimental than monetary value. The insurance companies that had paid out claims 3 decades ago recovered much of their losses, though the legal complications of who owned what, after so much time, proved complex and contentious. Derek himself received no financial reward for his honesty, just as Detective Martinez had warned him. The police department gave him a civilian commendation, a framed certificate that he hung on the wall of his apartment where it gathered dust. The media picked up the story, and for a brief moment, Derek was featured in local news broadcasts and a few national news websites as the honest sailboat buyer who chose to return a fortune instead of keeping it. The attention was uncomfortable and died away quickly, as public attention always does. What Derek did receive, however, was something unexpected. One of the families whose jewelry had been recovered, a wealthy couple from Charleston whose stolen items had been valued at over $300,000, sent Derek a personal letter thanking him for his integrity. The letter included a check for $5,000, a gesture of appreciation that the couple insisted was not a reward, but simply a thank you from people who understood what Derek had sacrificed. Other families followed suit, sending smaller amounts. And when all was said and done, Derek received nearly $12,000 in what the lawyers carefully termed gifts rather than rewards to avoid legal complications. Combined with the money he had already saved in his tackle box, Derek now had just over $23,000, enough to properly refit his sailboat and outfit it for coastal cruising. Over the next year, Derek transformed the battered vessel he had bought at auction into a seaworthy cruiser. He installed a new engine, repaired the electrical system, replaced all the rotten wood, and re-rigged the mast with new lines and hardware. He named the boat Second Chances, a name that caused Detective Martinez to laugh when she came to the marina to see the completed vessel. Derek took a leave of absence from the boatyard and spent 3 months sailing down the coast to Florida, across to the Bahamas, and back, fulfilling a dream that had sustained him for over 2 decades. The sailing was everything his grandfather had described, moments of profound peace, punctuated by challenges that required all his skill and attention. Nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and days when the only sound was wind and water. When Derek returned to Savannah, he went back to work at the boatyard, resumed his life of repairing other people's engines, but with a fundamental difference. He had discovered that he was the kind of person who could be tempted by fortune, but who would ultimately choose integrity over wealth. He had learned that the right choice isn't always the rewarding choice, at least not in ways that can be measured in dollars. He had proven to himself that his grandfather's values, the principles of honor and honesty that had seemed almost quaint in the modern world, were still worth upholding, even when doing so cost him dearly. The story of Derek Hutchins and the sailboat from the police auction became something of a legend in the Savannah maritime community, passed around in marina bars and boat club meetings as a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Some people praised Derek's integrity, while others privately thought he was a fool for turning in a fortune that he could have kept with minimal risk of being caught. Derek himself refused to discuss it much, uncomfortable with attention and increasingly certain that he had made the only choice he could live with. The Pelican case, the map and the ledger were stored as evidence in a police facility somewhere. Permanent records of crimes committed 3 decades ago and finally resolved. The Sailboat, once a wrecked vessel seized in a drug bust, now cut through coastal waters with grace and purpose, carrying a man who had found something more valuable than gold and jewel. He had found the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. What kind of person am I when faced with temptation? Derek discovered that he was his grandfather's grandson, a man who valued the ability to look at himself in the mirror more than he valued wealth gained through morally questionable means. The universal lesson in Derek's story extends far beyond sailing and treasure hunting. It speaks to a fundamental human dilemma that we all face in various forms throughout our lives. We are constantly presented with opportunities to take shortcuts, to benefit from situations where the right choice conflicts with the profitable choice, where we must decide whether our integrity is situational or fundamental. Derek's decision to report what he found wasn't easy or obvious. He didn't stumble into virtue by accident. He sat on that muddy, spoil island for an hour, wrestling with himself, weighing his dreams against his principles, and ultimately chose the harder path. His story reminds us that integrity isn't about what we do when people are watching or when the choice is easy. It's about what we do when we're alone, when no one would ever know, when the cost of doing the right thing is measured in sacrificed dreams and opportunities that will never come again. Derek gave up a fortune, but he gained something that no amount of stolen jewelry could purchase. He gained the certainty that he was who he wanted to be, that he could trust himself, that his principles weren't just abstract concepts he endorsed in conversation, but concrete values he would uphold even when doing so hurt. In a world that increasingly seems to reward the cynical, the opportunistic, and those willing to rationalize away ethical concerns, Derek's choice stands as a quiet rebellion, a statement that some things remain more important than money. His story challenges us to ask ourselves, what would we do in his position? Would we have the strength to choose honor over fortune? Especially when the fortune seemed to have no legitimate owner and the choice seemed to harm no one. These are uncomfortable questions because they force us to confront who we really are beneath the person we present to the world. For those of us who dream of adventure on the water, who are drawn to sailing and the freedom it represents, Derek's story contains an additional lesson. The sea has a way of revealing who we truly are. It strips away the comfortable lies we tell ourselves and exposes our character in moments of decision that can't be delegated or deferred. Derek bought a wrecked sailboat hoping to find escape and adventure, but what he actually found was a test of his own soul, a challenge that had nothing to do with navigation or seamanship and everything to do with the kind of person he would choose to be. He passed that test, not perfectly and not without struggle, but he passed it. And in passing it, he earned something far more valuable than the fortune he relinquished. He earned the right to sail those coastal waters, knowing that his vessel, however humble, carried a man of integrity, someone who had faced temptation and chosen honor. That knowledge, that self-respect, that ability to live without the corrosive poison of guilty secrets is a treasure that compound interest can never diminish and that no thief can ever steal. It is the fortune that Derek Hutchins ultimately claimed from that wrecked sailboat at the police auction, a prize more valuable than anything marked on a hidden map, a reward that will sustain him through whatever storms and calms the future hold. His story stands as a testament to the enduring value of choosing the right path even when it costs us dearly, and as a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures we find are not the ones we keep, but the ones we have the courage to give back.